So David, tell us what's been happening down in Canterbury.
Well, back in 2007, there's a growing realisation that Canterbury health system couldn't keep functioning the way that it was if it was going to meet the needs of the needs and the challenges of the future. And a beginning part of that was starting to say, so what does the future look like if we carry on doing what we're doing? We'd have to build another hospital the same size as the current Christchurch Hospital, which is about 500 or 600 beds, another 2,000 aged care beds, and about another 20% GPs. And a bit of a sense of actually, even if we had the resources, the reality of being able to do that was not going to be
You wouldn't be able to find the staff even if you had the money?
Couldn't find the staff even if we had the money.
Yeah, yeah. So what then happened? So you decided you couldn't go on the way you were?
So part of that is that it's a perennial question. So how do you make it real for people? How does that turn into a burning platform that is just not rhetoric from either government or health organisations really trying to twist your arm to believe in something that doesn't sound that real? And so what we began there was a journey that was called 2020. We used a lot of external industries, organisations like Air New Zealand, some of the retail sectors, some of the leading sports franchises in the country, in terms of starting to find languages that could transcend a lot of the historical language we've used. Also underpinning that, we started what was called Accelerate program, which is an experiential leadership development that had people going out to sectors and learning really learning some of their key learnings, how they've dealt with issues and how that might be reflected back into a health environment.
Right. And a lot of this was using things like Lean and Six Sigma.
But based on a lot of the methodology around Lean, Six Sigma, also starting to introduce people to things like chaos theory. What does system design look like? And actually, what does systems thinking look and feel like? So that to get a sense of a whole, and that's where the benefit of lean thinking then comes underneath that, in terms of it's got a place.
Right, right. Normally, if you say to doctors, we're going to do something like lean, and they use this in industry and elsewhere, they'll say, well, patients aren't cars or baked beans, and how does this apply to patients?
So a trick with that is converting a different language for a different sector into a health language. And the health language that we've used is patient's time. How do we value the patient's time? And within that, actually, the biggest wastage we've got in health is patient's time, because we cunningly experts at designing waiting into every part of a system we've got. And we have people bouncing from one part of a health system to another. And being able to get that language of wastage and patient's time, that, I guess, became one of the the enablers of being able to say, well, actually, no, we've got and we can learn from others.
So is it almost a sort of backwards round discovery? If you stop wasting the patient's time, you stop wasting the staff's time as well.
Yep.
The thing gets more efficient.
And actually, there's a funny thing is we find we've got enough resource to do just about everything we need to do. What we've invested in long term is sustained leadership development and a range of events that continue to make this real for people. So we employ directly about 9,000 people. So just through Accelerate, if you take 18,000 people that work in the Canterbury health system in primary care, aged care, and also the hospital sector, we've had about 1,000 out of the 18,000 in total that have been there. But we've also used other vehicles like the Showcase, and back in 2009, an interactive experience set up in a warehouse that was really about where we are now and what the future might look like. And we had about 2,000 people through that. And we've just recently completed a new version of the Showcase. We've had about 3,500 people through in the last 6 to 7 weeks.
Right. So this is almost creating a sort of social movement to change the way the thing works.
Unless you kind of believe that you can make a difference, why would you? And if it's not part of the ongoing fabric or DNA of the health system here, then it will wither and die.
Right.
So one of the things we've been quite deliberate is being quite relentless and making sure this is not a commitment today that we're not going to do tomorrow, or when we're under fiscal pressures, it's something that we drop. This is probably the last thing we will drop with anything we do.
At the same time, one of the things that's impressed me down here is you've got this slogan, so to speak, one system, one budget, when the reality is there is not one system, one budget. I mean, you do have the advantage of funding both health and social care. You've got general practice out there separately. You contract for an awful lot of your community nursing and other sorts of things. You have to contract with your labs and your radiology. And there's at least 2 public funders, and there's a lot of co-payment. So in a sense, it's not one system.
In reality, it's not. But until people feel as though they are part of one system,
Yep.
why would I change what I'm doing?
Yep.
How do I interact? Or why would I interact? And so by creating a sense of belonging under that you're part of one system, the reality is we've still only got $1 that we can spend anywhere in the system. So getting people understanding that there's no sense bouncing people around from one place to another because we're shooting ourselves collectively in the foot.
And what's been the result of all this? Can you give me some examples of things that have changed in the way you do things?
Look, a lot of things have changed radically. I think the biggest part is the re-engaging and the re-professionalising those that work within health, that sense of pride that we can do, that we are architects of the health system. And if I put my discretionary effort into something today, I'll change something tomorrow. And that's probably been one of the most powerful things that we have been able to bring to life. That's also then enabled a real sense of the single system and one budget. So what we've done is we've stopped or removed a lot of the barriers between whether you're primary care, secondary care. The debates and arguments are not now about funding or contracts. They're about how do we make this better for the patient and how do we reduce time. So that's the fundamental part of anything we do, is now underpinning that.
For an outsider coming in to look at this, there have been an enormous number of initiatives. I mean, and more acronyms than I can cope with. But I mean, you've got a lot of acute demand. You've got something you call CRESS, which is pulling people out the back. You've got new health pathways. You've changed the way radiology works. And an outsider might say it feels a bit like initiative-itis. There's an enormous number of things have been changing at once. How do you know which is actually having the biggest impact on what you're doing?
We can't, but one of the things of actually changing a system, if we just focus on one thing, we disengage the rest of the health system. We've been really deliberate. We want to engage a whole system, and within that we've had to become a lot more comfortable with lots of things happening at the same time. But that's also been a really important part of that sense of actually I can make a difference. Me as a health professional re-engaging because I think I can make a difference tomorrow. And while some would look at that and say, can't get a head around the number of initiatives, we would see that as one of the real strengths. But what we do have to do then is pull some of that back in, because you do end up with a bit of duplication. But actually that's okay. Yeah. That's all part of we're wanting everyone involved, not just, well, we've decided this area we think is the most important, let's focus on that and do that well. Because if we just fix single isolated bits, we don't really move a system on.
The earthquake we briefly mentioned. The earthquake was, of course, a devastating event, and I think, having been here, it's difficult for people from the outside to understand that it still has a huge ongoing impact 2 years on. I've heard some people in New Zealand say you've only been able to do what you did because of the earthquake. Faced with a crisis, the system, rather than falling over, did respond. And it's clear that the earthquake speeded up some of the things you were doing. You put in an electronic record very quickly, you expanded your acute demand program and various other things. But was it the earthquake?
No. The health system in Canterbury should have imploded with the impact of the earthquake. Overnight we lost 650 aged care beds, 105 acute inpatient beds. We already had the lowest acute medical admitting rates in the country, and we were stretched for capacity then. And no matter which way, and over 12,500 hospital rooms that are damaged to varying degrees. If you looked at that totally, we should have ground to a standstill. We didn't, because the system in Canterbury was working in a particular way before the earthquake. And what it enabled it to do was to respond and change to a different set of external influences or challenges, and in this case an earthquake. What the earthquake has done has accelerated a number of the changes that we were planning to do out over the next 4 or 5 years. Just about every single one of those has now happened. So the benefit of the earthquake was speeding up a direction of travel that we were already on. But none of that could have happened without the investment and the foundations that were already in place.
So if you were, for want of a better way of describing it, Mrs. Smith sitting in the Canterbury health system, what is better now than was the case 5, 6 years ago?
In terms of with the health pathways component, I'll use that as an example, is regardless of where you go in primary care in Canterbury, you're going to receive the same care, treatment and timeliness. And you're more likely to get access to the care you need in the right time and the right place. Post-earthquake with the CREST program, being discharged from hospital, having a nurse or a care worker meeting you at home, and through an outcomes-based framework for your rehabilitation at home, has been probably one of the most widely talked about things in our elderly community. I don't think we had any sense of them taking ownership to the extent they have of a health delivery framework that has totally met their needs.
So you think it's sustainable?
I think the sustainability is building in. There's a number of things that no matter what happened now, the system wouldn't go backwards. There are some other areas where it's still very fragile, and we could lose some of the gains and benefits if we don't continue to kind of water and tend
Right.
to those sort of programs.
Yeah.
And we've also got to be really clear that we don't become introspective, that we continue to be looking externally.
There are many ways people seek to try and improve public services generally and health in particular. Would it be fair to say the main thing that's happened here has been building the capacity inside the organisation and outside the organisation in other parts of the health system to try to actually introduce, to get professionals and individuals themselves to introduce change? Has that been the key piece of what you've been doing?
It has been. To get sustained change, it can't be done to. You've actually got to have those that work in the system, and in this particular case the Canterbury Health System, believing they can make a difference, that they can really reshape and redesign the way they're doing things. And to have targets, yes, they have a place, but if that's the only thing you're responding to, you're going to miss the point. And it will get in the way of integrating systems because the focus is always on single or siloed parts of a health system. The importance of building the capability, the importance of long-term investment in building that capability is really essential. And it also builds that sense of reconnection, that sense of pride, that sense of can-do, that sense of actually there's nothing we can't do. We may not know the answer, we may not have the solution, but actually we know the problem, and collectively we'll get our heads around that in one form or other, using lots of different inputs to help us on that journey.
And in getting these changes to happen, how crucial has primary care been, and how crucial has the way it's linked into the system been?
Really fundamental. One of the real strengths that we've built off in Canterbury is a long history of organised general practice. But as with anything, you get parts, whether it be primary care or general practice or hospital part of the system, out of balance, you end up with conflict. In terms of getting that sense of equal parties, equal partners, that's where you turn the real power of organised primary care into a major part and stakeholder in the way that hospitals are operating. And likewise, hospitals feeling they're part of and have got a sense of ownership with primary care.
When people talk about integrated care around the world, a number of them have the belief that doing integrated care will actually shrink the hospital. Now, that's not happened in Christchurch hospitals. I mean, you did lose some beds from the earthquake, and it's important to acknowledge that, but it hasn't shrunk the hospital. You're going to build a new one, which will indeed be a bit bigger than the one you've got. Does that mean this isn't working?
I think there are probably two ways to look at that. One in terms of, I think it's a fatal flaw of people continuing to think you shrink the size of hospitals. You can change the demand curve. We should not be building bigger and bigger hospitals, and really passionate and clear about that. You can change the demand curve. In fact, you don't need bigger hospitals. Then on the flip side of that, we are building a new hospital that has kind of a small number more beds, but most of that is actually reflecting some demographics, particularly in the elderly, but also the basis that we've started off an incredibly low hospital admitting rate relative to the rest of the country. Now within that, we're going to be building about 200 less beds than what we would have done if we continued to do what we were doing back in 2007 and 2008.
Coming from the UK, one apparent advantage you have is that you fund both health and social care through the board. How helpful has that been in being able to produce this spectrum of integrated care?
I think really, really important. The more you silo funding or contractual relationships, the more you're embedding in disintegrated, non-integrated care. By being the sole planner and funder of a system, the ability to have parties working in a different way and then to look at where the resourcing goes enables us to incentivise the areas that need to be incentivised, and also to free up resourcing where it doesn't need to be spent. If you're having to rely on multiple different interactions to deal with that, the likelihood of ever overcoming those interactions is pretty small. And in many health systems, we spend so much time at those interfaces battling.
Right.
Because it's your problem or someone else's issue, and if only they behave differently, then life would be cool. In this situation here is actually, it's our problem, and we have nowhere else to go other than looking at ourselves as to why this is not working.
David, thank you very much.